Imagine taking off in a small aircraft, the weather perfect and the sky clear, only for something simple and easily overlooked to turn a routine flight into a fight for your life. That's exactly what happened on July 7, 2020, when a trusted Cessna 172N Skyhawk II, despite being a common choice for general aviation, crashed shortly after takeoff near Lake Tahoe. What went wrong? How did a seemingly minor mistake lead to the engine losing power, leaving the aircraft struggling to clear the terrain? Could this disaster have been avoided with a single simple action? The answers will be revealed as we uncover the critical factors behind this tragic crash in this video. The aircraft involved was a Cessna 172N Skyhawk II, tail number November 6328 Delta. It's a popular plane among general aviation pilots, single engine, high wing, and built to seat 4 people. It's the kind of aircraft you'd expect to see at any small airport across the country, often used for training, sightseeing, or personal travel. Nothing about the aircraft itself was out of the ordinary. It wasn't experimental, and there were no commercial operations tied to this flight. It was, by all accounts, a typical private flight conducted under Part 91 regulations, meaning it fell squarely into the category of general aviation for personal use. The man in the pilot's seat was no stranger to flying or high-stakes operations. He was Commander Christopher Joas, 53 years old, a senior flight surgeon in the U.S. Navy. At the time, he was stationed at Naval Air Station Fallon, home of the Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Center, better known as NAWDC. Joas had been there since June of 2017, and he was just weeks away from transferring to a new post at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in California. Joas brought with him a wealth of experience from the naval aviation world. Before Fallon, he served with VX-9, an elite test and evaluation squadron at Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, where he worked as a flight physician and flight surgeon. He was also a key member of the Longhorns Search and Rescue Team, known for stepping up in emergencies. In one notable mission in July 2019, he helped rescue an injured rock climber near Donner Summit, just west of Truckee, California. His role wasn't just behind the scenes, he was hands-on, often participating directly in challenging nighttime operations. This was a man used to being calm under pressure. Joining him on the flight was Margaret McGuire, 51, known as Peggy to those close to her. She had a history in small business, having run a boutique called 8 Pieces of 8 Fine Jewelry in Fallon, Nevada. But just 2 months before the flight, she had closed her business and relocated to Reno. Her connection with Joas appeared to be personal rather than professional, friends through their time in Fallon, possibly closer. They traveled in overlapping social circles, and friends noted a bond between them that suggested more than casual acquaintance. While official documents don't specify what the purpose of the flight was that day, all signs point to it being a leisure trip, perhaps a scenic ride over the Sierra Nevada, or simply an afternoon getaway. No flight plan was filed, which is common for visual flights in clear weather conditions. In such cases, pilots rely on visual flight rules. Shortly after 3:20 p.m. on July 7, 2020, the Cessna 172 NS Skyhawk lifted off from runway 18 at Lake Tahoe Airport. Eyewitnesses described the aircraft as flying unusually low. Instead of climbing high above the terrain, November 6328 Delta appeared to struggle, barely maintaining altitude as it passed over the trees and neighborhoods at the southern end of the valley. One observer, a 13-year-old Civil Air Patrol cadet, noted the plane was just a couple hundred feet above ground level as it moved south. He'd heard the sound first, a sputtering, uneven engine noise that pulled him outside to investigate. What he saw matched what others reported. The aircraft's engine was not running smoothly. It was surging and dropping in power, an audible sign that the Cessna was in distress. The cadet also noticed something else, what looked like oil streaks across the plane's spinner and windshield. Though the propeller was still spinning, the engine wasn't delivering full thrust. The aircraft seemed to limp forward, hugging the landscape, failing to gain altitude despite clear weather and open skies. As it continued south, the terrain gradually began to rise, placing the low-flying aircraft on a collision course with the trees ahead. Onlookers in the Myers neighborhood grew concerned as they watched the Skyhawk press forward at treetop level. Then came the critical moment. One witness saw the aircraft's left wingtip clip the top of a tree. The impact caused the Cessna to yaw sharply, disrupting whatever fragile control the pilot still had. Though the aircraft remained airborne briefly, it had lost all ability to recover. It dropped below the tree line and within seconds disappeared from view. Witnesses reported that the sputtering engine suddenly went silent. At approximately 3:23 p.m., barely 3 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into a wooded area near Rainbow Road and Highway 89 in the town of Myers. Several residents heard the impact and rushed toward the crash site. The wreckage was found in a clearing amid tall pines and granite boulders. The Cessna lay inverted, its landing gear pointed skyward, the fuselage badly crushed. A retired firefighter living nearby was one of the first to arrive. He found the aircraft on its back, with both occupants still strapped into their seats. The pilot, Commander Joas, was unresponsive. He was found deceased at the scene. The passenger, Margaret McGuire, was injured but conscious, able to speak to rescuers. She was rescued alive, but tragically succumbed to her injuries 5 days later. As investigators began 328 Delta, it became clear that this was not the result of a single catastrophic failure, but rather a tragic convergence of several factors, each compounding the last. Environmental conditions, aircraft performance limitations, and pilot decision-making all played significant roles. Yet, among all these variables, one stood out as both the most preventable and the most consequential: the pilot's failure to properly lean the fuel mixture for high-altitude operations. Lake Tahoe Airport sits at approximately 6,269 feet above sea level. At that elevation, the thinner air affects nearly every aspect of aircraft performance. Lift is reduced, takeoff rolls are longer, and engines, especially normally aspirated ones like in a Cessna 172, must be carefully adjusted to run efficiently. A key part of that adjustment is leaning the fuel-air mixture. In simple terms, at higher altitudes, there's less oxygen available, so feeding the engine the same amount of fuel as you would at sea level results in a mixture that's too rich. The engine can't burn it efficiently, which leads to rough running, reduced power, and over time, serious mechanical issues. That's exactly what happened here. Investigators found that the engine in November 6328 Delta had been running overly rich for some time. The evidence was clear. Carbon and lead deposits had rapidly built up on the spark plugs and exhaust valve in cylinder number 4, leading to that cylinder's partial failure. This wasn't just a little dirt or minor wear, it was enough to significantly reduce engine output. Most critically, this partial loss of power occurred right when the aircraft needed it most, during the takeoff climb, when climb performance is already limited due to terrain and altitude. What made this failure especially telling was the speed at which it developed. The engine had logged just 26 hours since its last overhaul, a time frame far too short for this level of fouling under normal conditions. The accelerated buildup pointed directly to improper mixture management over a series of previous flights. This wasn't a mechanical failure born of bad luck, it was a slow-motion problem created by routine neglect of a fundamental operating procedure. Unlike adverse weather or the elevation of the terrain, the mixture setting is entirely in the pilot's hands. It's a step taught early in flight training, reiterated in every aircraft's pilot operating handbook, and drilled into pilots who fly in mountainous regions. A proper leaning procedure before takeoff, especially at a high-elevation airport like Lake Tahoe, should be as habitual as buckling a seatbelt. Yet for reasons we may never fully know, that step wasn't taken here. Whether it was oversight, complacency, or a lack of familiarity with the specific aircraft's engine behavior, the result was the same. The engine wasn't able to produce full power. And that one omission became the first domino in a cascading sequence of events. With degraded engine performance, the aircraft was no longer capable of climbing at the rate necessary to clear the steadily rising terrain to the south. The environmental conditions, warm summer air, high-density altitude, and surrounding mountainous terrain turned from challenges into obstacles. In normal conditions, a fully functioning Cessna 172 could have climbed out of the basin, even if slowly. But with one cylinder out of the fight, the aircraft was essentially limping forward, barely staying aloft, and slowly losing the battle with gravity. Eyewitness reports of the engine surging, sputtering, and producing an unusual sound all support this narrative. So do the oil streaks observed across the spinner and windshield, symptoms of a compromised power plant. The aircraft wasn't downed by a sudden weather event or catastrophic engine explosion. It was brought low by a preventable, progressive degradation that started with an overly rich mixture and ended with an irrecoverable loss of altitude. Other contributing factors deserve mention. The pilot did not file a flight plan, and although this wasn't legally required under visual flight rules, it meant there was no official route or altitude selection to follow, nor any pre-filed performance planning. Terrain awareness and climb gradient planning are especially critical at airports surrounded by mountains, and it's unclear how thoroughly this was considered before departure. But even those decisions pale in comparison to the one simple error that triggered the accident. The failure to lean the mixture robbed the engine of performance, which in turn robbed the pilot of time, options, and control. It turned a routine takeoff into a low-level emergency with no margin for recovery. So what's the takeaway? It's this. Never underestimate the little stuff. Whether you're a student pilot flying your first solo or a decorated military aviator with years of experience, the basics still matter. The checklist is your friend. The POH isn't just a suggestion. And leaning the mixture? At a place like Lake Tahoe, that's not just a good idea, it's a lifeline. Flying at high altitudes is like running a marathon uphill. It's hard enough without tripping over your shoelaces. Don't let a fouled spark plug be the reason your perfect day in the sky turns into a struggle for altitude. So lean that mixture, double-check your run-up, and if the engine doesn't sound right, don't force it into the sky. As the saying goes, it's better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were on the ground. Fly smart, fly safe, and don't forget to lean. On the evening of September 11th, 2022, an already somber day etched into American memory, tragedy nearly struck again, this time above the peaceful waters of Horsetooth Reservoir in Colorado. Just before 7 p.m. local time, two experienced pilots lifted off from Boulder Municipal Airport in a Cessna 172M, tail number November 9049 Hotel. But what followed was anything but routine. Instead of exercising caution and professionalism, the pilots engaged in a series of low-altitude maneuvers that defied both training and common sense, turning a scenic reservoir into the backdrop for a reckless aerial stunt. The result? A crash that was not the product of mechanical failure or bad weather, but of deliberate decisions made in clear violation of safety and judgment. So, how does a flight manned by two highly trained aviators end in such preventable disaster? Let's find out in this episode of Flig Debrief. The reservoir, nestled among Colorado's foothills near Fort Collins, was alive that Sunday with boaters and families enjoying the late summer sun. Few could have predicted that a small plane would soon skim unnervingly close to the water, swooping within mere feet of several occupied boats. According to flight path data, the aircraft made a low-altitude approach over the reservoir before descending into a dramatic and dangerous sequence. A low pass over one boat, a steep climb, a sudden right bank, and another pass just above a second vessel. Moments later, the plane turned sharply into a nearby cove and disappeared from view, only to crash into the unforgiving rise of the terrain. By the time first responders reached the crash site, both men on board had miraculously survived, albeit with minor injuries. The Cessna, however, had not been so lucky. The aircraft sustained substantial damage to its fuselage and both wings, damage consistent with a high-impact collision into elevated terrain. According to the NTSB, the final recorded altitude was approximately 6,075 feet above mean sea level, an elevation that placed the plane dangerously close to the sloping topography surrounding the reservoir. In the weeks that followed, the NTSB's analysis reached a sobering conclusion. The crash was not caused by mechanical failure or weather. Instead, it was attributed to the pilot's deliberate low-altitude maneuvering and the failure to maintain safe clearance from rising terrain. It was, in short, a crash born not of chance, but of human error and questionable judgment on a day already fraught with heavy meaning. Sitting in the right seat of the Cessna that evening was Ahmed El-Qada, a certified flight instructor with the credentials to match. He was 35 years old at the time of the crash. Holding an airline transport pilot certificate and multiple instructor ratings, Ahmed wasn't just a casual flyer. He was a professional with over 3,500 hours of total flight time, more than 330 of those logged in the very type of aircraft they were flying. He had passed his most recent flight review only 3 months prior, in June of 2022. On paper, he was more than capable. But what happened next didn't reflect his training or his responsibilities as a certified instructor. Immediately following the accident, Ahmad gave a series of conflicting accounts. In his first interview with the NTSB, he said there had been an engine issue, prompting him to climb away from the lake to avoid the boats below. But that version quickly changed. In a written statement submitted days later, He claimed the power reduction had been intentional, done to get a better look at the surrounding scenery. According to him, it was during this low-power glide that the pilot flying, his brother, reported a jammed elevator. Ahmad stated he then took over and attempted to regain control using only trim and throttle, maneuvering toward the reservoir in a desperate attempt to fix the controls mid-flight. If the inconsistencies in Ahmad's story weren't enough to raise red flags, the background of the man in the left seat certainly added a layer of complexity. Hamad El-Qada, 38 years old at the time of the crash, held a commercial pilot certificate and had reportedly amassed around 7,000 hours of total flight experience. That level of experience should have implied confidence and professionalism. Yet there were troubling gaps in his pilot history. No FAA medical certificate on record, and no recent flight review. In other words, despite his extensive hours, he may not have even been legally current to fly at the time of the crash. Questions began to swirl. Why were two highly experienced pilots, both with enough flight time to know better, engaged in such dangerous maneuvers so close to the ground? Why were their explanations contradictory, and why did they fail to take even the most basic emergency steps, like declaring an emergency or climbing away from rising terrain? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was this a case of poor judgment or something more deliberate? As the investigation unfolded, the inconsistencies in the pilot's statements became glaringly evident, but it was the analysis of the aircraft's flight path and mechanical condition that painted the clearest picture of what really happened. Eyewitness accounts and photographic evidence told one story, and it was one that raised serious questions about the pilot's true intentions. Several photographs captured the plane in remarkably low passes over the water, with the aircraft barely clearing the boats below. One witness described the plane's approach as initially aiming for the shore, only for it to make a sudden left turn, dangerously diving towards one of the few boats on the water. After making a disturbingly low pass, the plane sharply climbed, banked hard to the right, and then executed another low-altitude pass over a second boat. It was reckless and, frankly, inexplicable behavior for pilots of their experience, pilots who should have known better. But it was the flight track data that truly exposed the flaws in the pilot's story. According to the recorded flight data, the airplane's path didn't align with what Ahmad had described in his statement. Instead of the smooth, controlled descent that he mentioned, the aircraft descended during a 270-degree turn over the reservoir. The plane then flew nearly 1.6 miles along the southern side of the reservoir before climbing away from the water. The data showed that the aircraft was at an altitude of around 6,075 feet when it crashed, which was consistent with the area's terrain but far too close to the rising hills for comfort. This flight data raised the first of many questions. If Ahmad's version of events were accurate, why was the flight path so different from his narrative? His claim that the airplane reduced power to see the scenery seemed more like an after-the-fact justification than a genuine explanation for what transpired. In reality, a power reduction in such a critical phase of flight could easily lead to a dangerous situation, especially in a low-altitude mountainous area where terrain clearance was so limited. Then, there was the issue of the elevator jam, a key part of Ahmad's claim. The flight controls were thoroughly examined after the crash, and the results were unequivocal. There was no sign of any mechanical failure. The elevator, the very part Ahmad insisted was jammed, was fully functional. Flight control continuity was confirmed from the yoke to all flight control surfaces, and there was no binding or mechanical anomalies found that would have impeded normal operation. If the elevator had indeed jammed, it would have been immediately noticeable during a pre-flight check, and more importantly, it would have rendered the aircraft uncontrollable in the manner Ahmad described. The aircraft could still have been flown using the trim and throttle, and the pilots, as experienced as they were, should have known how to adapt to that scenario without flying low over the water and directly toward boats. The NTSB's conclusion was damning. The investigation showed that the Cessna had not experienced an engine failure, a jammed elevator, or any other mechanical issue that could explain the pilot's actions. Instead, it became glaringly clear that the pilots had engaged in intentional, reckless, low-level maneuvers, deliberately flying toward the boats without regard for their own safety or the safety of those below. The NTSB didn't mince words. The probable cause of the crash was the pilots' failure to maintain clearance from rising terrain while intentionally maneuvering the airplane at low altitudes. In essence, they made a choice to fly dangerously, and that choice led to a crash. The failure to follow standard emergency procedures added another layer of negligence. There were no distress calls made, no attempts to climb away from rising terrain, and no effort to declare an emergency. If the pilots had truly been in trouble, as their statements suggested, the logical steps would have been to gain altitude, assess the situation, and communicate with air traffic control. But instead they continued flying recklessly, demonstrating a shocking lack of judgment and an unwillingness to prioritize safety. In the end, this wasn't just a case of poor decision-making, it was a blatant disregard for the basic principles of flight. The evidence pointed to a story of pilots who thought they could push their limits, who wanted to impress, or perhaps just indulge in a moment of thrill without considering the potential consequences. And as we now know, the consequences were severe, both for the aircraft and for the people who were lucky to walk away from the wreckage. The aftermath of the crash was filled with legal actions, questions about accountability, and an unsettling realization that this could have been much worse. The NTSB, after completing its investigation, determined that mechanical failure played no role in the crash. Instead, the blame rested squarely on the pilots' shoulders for their reckless decision-making, low-altitude maneuvers, and failure to maintain basic safety procedures. The FAA, after reviewing the findings, confirmed that the crash was entirely avoidable. They made it clear that the aircraft was fully capable of normal operation. There was no reason for the pilots to push the aircraft beyond its safe limits, let alone fly at such low altitudes over the reservoir. The investigation showed that both pilots should have been able to recover the situation safely had they followed proper protocol. But the NTSB's conclusion wasn't the only fallout. Ahmad al-Qada, who had been the flight instructor on the flight, found himself facing legal consequences. The local district attorney's office filed criminal charges against him for his reckless actions. He was charged with 5 counts of menacing and 6 counts of reckless endangerment, reflecting the danger he put others in, both the boaters on the water and his own passengers. However, the story took another strange turn when Ahmad fled the country shortly after his NTSB interview, leaving behind more questions than answers. While the legal system had its own processes to follow, the aviation community had its own lessons to learn. The FBI, somewhat unsurprisingly, had been involved due to the timing of the incident on September 11th, but ultimately, it was the blatant disregard for aviation safety that overshadowed everything. The pilots' failure to adhere to basic flight protocols and their hasty, illogical decisions made this an avoidable accident, and one that could have easily turned out much worse. But what can other pilots take away from this? Let's just say it's a lesson in humility. Aviation isn't a playground for stunts or showing off, it's a responsibility. No flight is so important that it's worth jeopardizing your safety, or the safety of others, for the thrill of a risky maneuver. So, to all the pilots out there, next time you're tempted to take that low pass, think about the consequences first. The views might be amazing, but so is coming home safely. Stay sharp, follow the rules, and remember, there's no such thing as a routine flight when it comes to your judgment. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe for more aviation updates. See ya! June 4th, 2023, 3:23 p.m. A Cessna Citation, 560, slicing through the skies on a routine flight, plunges into the rugged terrain of Virginia's George Washington National Forest, claiming all 4 aboard. This chilling tragedy, unfolding over hours of eerie silence, demands answers about how a seasoned pilot and a family bound for New York met their end. Let's dive into the timeline and see what we've got. The aircraft, tail number November 611 Victor Golf, was a 1990 Cessna 560 Citation VI, owned by Encore Motors of Melbourne, Inc., and operated under FAA Part 91 for personal transport. On that fateful Sunday, it carried a 69-year-old pilot, a retired airline captain, and 3 passengers, the owner's daughter, her young daughter, and their nanny. Their journey began unremarkably, but a cascade of events would soon spiral into catastrophe, drawing the attention of NORAD's F-16 and leaving investigators scrambling for clues. The flight's path, meticulously logged by ADS-B data and air traffic control records, tells a story of precision turned to chaos, with a silent cockpit at its heart. The day started with a routine leg from Melbourne International Airport, Florida, at 10:59 a.m., landing smoothly at Elizabethton Municipal Airport, Tennessee, by 12:31 p.m. There, the Citation took on 300 gallons of fuel, and the 3 passengers boarded for the next leg to Long Island MacArthur Airport, New York. Departing Elizabethton at 1:13 p.m., the pilot's voice crackled over the radio, reporting a climb through 9,300 feet to 10,000 feet. Atlanta Center cleared the flight to 23,000 feet, then 29,000, and finally 34,000 feet by 1:25 p.m. But at 1:28 p.m., a critical moment passed unnoticed. Controllers instructed the pilot to halt the climb at 33,000 feet for traffic, yet no response came. The jet continued to 34,000 feet, leveled off, and fell silent, a haunting prelude to the disaster ahead. By 2:32 p.m., November 611, Victor Golf reached the skies above MacArthur Airport, still cruising at 34,000 feet, with no attempt to descend for landing. Instead, the aircraft, likely guided by its autopilot, executed a sharp 180-degree turn near the Sea Isle VOR, swinging southwest on a 240-degree track. This unexpected maneuver sent it back toward its origin, skimming perilously close to restricted airspace over Washington, D.C. Air traffic controllers' repeated calls went unanswered, and by 3:20 p.m., NORAD scrambled F-16s from Andrews Air Force Base. The fighters intercepted the jet, their pilots signaling frantically with radio calls, wing rocks, and flares. Through the Citation's windows, they saw the pilot slumped over, unresponsive, a grim sign that the flight had been without human control for some time. The end came swiftly and violently. At 3:22 p.m., near the Montebello VOR, N611VG began a harrowing right-hand spiral from 34,000 feet, plummeting at nearly 28,800 feet per minute. 1 minute later, it slammed into forested terrain, shattering into fragments across a cratered impact site with traces of a post-impact fire. The wreckage, scattered and unrecognizable, bore the scars of a near-vertical, high-velocity descent, suggesting a sudden loss of control, perhaps from fuel exhaustion or autopilot failure. This devastating crash, far from its intended destination, marks the end of a flight that began with promise but ended in silence. The timeline of November 611 Victor Golf's final hours lays bare a chilling progression. From routine operations to an unresponsive cockpit, a wayward path, and a catastrophic plunge. As we shift focus to the pilot, the aircraft, and the conditions of that day, the question looms: what could silence a veteran aviator and send a reliable jet into an uncontrolled spiral? The answers lie ahead, in the details of experience, machinery, and the unforgiving realities of high-altitude flight. With the haunting timeline of November 611, Victor Golf's final flight etched in our minds, we turn to the human and mechanical elements at the heart of this tragedy. Who was the pilot guiding this Cessna Citation through the skies? What can we learn about the aircraft itself, a trusted workhorse of the skies, and what role did the environment play in those critical hours? These pieces, experience, engineering, and atmosphere, form the next layer of this puzzle, offering clues to why a routine journey ended in catastrophe. At the controls was a 69-year-old retired Southwest Airlines captain, a veteran aviator whose credentials spoke of a lifetime in the cockpit. Holding an airline transport pilot certificate, he was rated for single and multi-engine aircraft, with type certifications for an array of jets, including the CE-500 series, which encompasses the Citation 560. His logbook, as reported in May 2023, boasted 34,500 flight hours, with 850 hours in the CE-500 series, 110 of those logged in the past year alone. A first-class medical certificate, renewed in October 2022, affirmed his fitness to fly. This wasn't a novice, this was a pilot whose experience spanned decades, making the silence from the cockpit all the more perplexing. Investigators will probe whether this seasoned professional faced an unseen challenge, be it medical or environmental, that overwhelmed even his vast expertise. The aircraft, a 1990 Cessna 560 Citation V, was a stalwart of general aviation, known for its reliability and robust safety record. Operated by Encore Motors of Melbourne, Inc., this jet had been maintained under Part 91 regulations, with recent records noting a cockpit voice recorder installed as of May 20th, 23, though, troublingly, it remains unrecovered. Unlike larger airliners, it lacked a flight data recorder, a gap not required for this class of operation, but one that complicates the investigation. Without autothrottles, the Citation relied on manual throttle settings, likely left at takeoff power for the duration of the flight. Its Flight Management System, FMS, drove lateral navigation, guiding the jet along its programmed path, even as it failed to descend at Long Island. The autopilot's role, possibly attempting an ILS intercept before the U-turn, hints at a flight continuing on automation alone, raising questions about what incapacitated the human at the helm. The Citation's pressurization system, powered by engine bleed air, was designed to maintain a cabin altitude of 8,000 to 9,000 feet, even at 34,000 feet. Yet this system's failure could spell disaster, with emergency oxygen requiring manual activation, a critical step in a crisis. At 34,000 feet, the time of useful consciousness in a depressurization event shrinks to 30 to 60 seconds, a narrow window for action. Maintenance records, particularly Phase 4 inspections, will be scrutinized to determine if the pressurization system was recently serviced or flagged for issues. The aircraft's age and hours, while not unusual for a well-maintained jet, will also draw attention, as investigators seek to rule out mechanical betrayal in the face of such a catastrophic outcome. Environmental conditions on June 4, 2023, offered no obvious culprits. At the crash site near Montebello, Virginia, visual meteorological conditions prevailed, with 10 miles of visibility, broken clouds at 2,900 feet above ground, and light winds of 6 knots from 0-50 degrees. Daylight illuminated the forested terrain, ruling out darkness or severe weather as factors. The absence of turbulence or extreme temperatures further narrows the focus to onboard systems or human factors. Yet the high-altitude cruise at 34,000 feet places the spotlight on the invisible threat of cabin pressure, where even a subtle leak could turn deadly. These benign conditions, juxtaposed with the flight's dire outcome, underscore the likelihood of an internal failure, mechanical or physiological, that evaded the pilot's vigilance. The pilot's expertise, the Citation's proven design, and the clear skies of that Sunday afternoon paint a picture of normalcy upended by an unseen force. As we pivot to the potential causes of this crash, the focus sharpens on what could silence a veteran aviator and send a reliable jet into an uncontrolled descent. Was it the insidious creep of hypoxia, a sudden medical emergency, or a mechanical quirk that unraveled in seconds? These theories, grounded in the flight's chilling profile, await exploration as we seek to honor the lost with answers. The primary suspect here is hypoxia, a stealthy killer that starves the brain of oxygen, rendering even the most experienced pilot helpless. At 34,000 feet, a failure in the Citation's pressurization system could have let cabin altitude creep dangerously high, mimicking the external environment. The pilot's last communication, just 15 minutes after takeoff, aligns with a grim pattern. Insidious hypoxia often strikes within 20 minutes of a pressurization issue, lulling its victims into euphoria before unconsciousness. F-16 pilots reported the captain slumped over, a hallmark of oxygen deprivation, and speculation about frosted cockpit windows, though unconfirmed, suggests prolonged exposure to high-altitude conditions. If the bleed air system faltered or an outflow valve malfunctioned, the pilot, passengers, and their fate were sealed in minutes, with the autopilot soldiering on until fuel ran dry. This theory, haunting in its plausibility, hinges on the aircraft's pressurization maintenance history, a detail investigators will chase relentlessly. Yet other possibilities linger, though less likely. A sudden medical event, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, could have incapacitated the pilot, leaving the jet to its automated devices. This seems improbable given the pilot's clean first-class medical from October 20, 22, and his extensive experience, which included 34,500 hours of flight time. Unlike cases where pilot health has played a role, such as those we've explored in other accidents, the absence of prior medical flags makes this a long shot. Still, the NTSB will scrutinize the pilot's autopsy to rule out this silent assailant, ensuring no stone is left unturned in the quest for truth. Another scenario points to the flight's endgame: fuel starvation triggering a mechanical cascade. The Citation, cruising for hours on autopilot with throttles likely fixed at takeoff power, may have exhausted its fuel reserves, causing one engine to flame out before the other. This imbalance could have nudged the jet into a right-hand turn, overwhelming the autopilot's ability to maintain control. As the system disengaged, Perhaps due to excessive trim or loss of power, the aircraft entered its fatal spiral, plummeting at 28,800 feet per minute. This theory aligns with the crash's violent descent, but doesn't explain the pilot's earlier unresponsiveness, making it a secondary piece of the puzzle rather than the root cause. One thing is clear, the F-16 intercept played no role in the crash. NORAD's fighters followed protocol, using radio calls, flares, and wing rocks to rouse the pilot, but their efforts were met with silence. Unlike sensationalized narratives, there was no hostile engagement, just a desperate attempt to intervene in a flight already lost. This clarity shifts the focus back to the aircraft and its lone pilot, where the true answers lie, buried in maintenance logs, system designs, or the fleeting seconds of human vulnerability. These theories, hypoxia, medical emergency, or fuel-induced failure, each carry weight, but hypoxia stands out as the most compelling, echoing patterns seen in high-altitude aviation tragedies. As we turn to the lessons this accident offers, the focus shifts to prevention. How can pilots, armed with knowledge and vigilance, avoid the traps that claimed November 611 Victor Gulf? The answers, forged in the crucible of this loss, hold the power to reshape aviation safety for those who follow. So from what we've known so far, this tragedy urges pilots to combat hypoxia by learning personal symptoms through altitude chamber training and donning oxygen masks instantly at the first sign, as 30 to 60 seconds at 34,000 feet is all you've got. Master your aircraft's pressurization system, scrutinizing maintenance logs and practicing manual oxygen activation to catch failures before they turn deadly. Stay vigilant with constant cross-checks, as autopilot can't manage fuel or cabin pressure, and always monitor guard frequency to respond to intercept signals like NORAD's flares. Keep redundancy as your shield, give your oxygen mask a nod before takeoff, it's your wingman when the air runs thin, and fly sharp to honor the lost with safer skies. The NTSB has released its preliminary report on the December 2024 crash of a Cessna 310D, registered under tail number November 6979 Tango near Peebles, Ohio, a flight that began as a routine ferry operation and ended with a tragic outcome. As investigators piece together the early evidence, what emerges isn't a single catastrophic failure, but a layered story of mechanical quirks, operational decisions, and subtle oversights. In this video, we'll walk through the report's findings so far, but more importantly, we'll explore the deeper questions it raises. How do routine decisions in the cockpit quietly shape the fate of a flight long before anything goes wrong? This tragic flight involved 46-year-old Robert Harris Coles, a seasoned pilot and the general manager at Elite Air Service based in Vicksburg, Michigan. Coles was the sole occupant and operator of the aircraft. Known for his professional demeanor and experience in general aviation, Coles had taken on the responsibility of relocating the aircraft under a special ferry permit, a routine yet highly procedural task for an aircraft not meeting standard airworthiness criteria. This particular flight was not just any repositioning hop. The aircraft had recently changed ownership in October and had not undergone its required annual inspection. Despite this, the Federal Aviation Administration granted a ferry permit, allowing the plane to be moved strictly for maintenance purposes. The flight originated at Branch County Memorial Airport in Coldwater, Michigan, and was intended to conclude at Alexander Salomon Airport in West Union, Ohio. The goal was to get the aircraft to its new base where a full inspection and additional maintenance could be carried out. Operating under visual meteorological conditions, the flight was conducted under Part 91 regulations, a common set of rules that govern general aviation operations in the United States. However, what might have seemed like a straightforward ferry operation quickly turned into a complex and ultimately tragic event. With no formal flight plan filed and an aircraft carrying a history of maintenance issues, including known fuel system leaks, the flight took off into a situation that would soon spiral out of control. The flight departed at approximately 1:30 p.m. Conditions were favorable, and Robert Coles appeared confident as he guided the aging Cessna 310D into the sky. Notably, he wasn't flying completely alone in spirit. Another pilot, accompanying him in a separate aircraft, had planned to follow the ferry flight and rendezvous with Coles at the destination airport. Their in-flight communication, while brief, confirmed that things initially seemed normal. Coles gave no indication of trouble as they checked in multiple times along the route. However, things took a concerning turn late in the flight. The final radio transmission from Coles came when he reported being 20 to 30 miles from the destination airport and beginning his descent, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. But after that message, silence. When the second pilot landed at Alexander Salomon Airport and found no sign of Coles or the Cessna, concern quickly escalated. After waiting for roughly half an hour, the second pilot took off again to retrace the expected route, ultimately spotting the wreckage from the air roughly 40 minutes later. A key witness, located on property adjacent to the crash site, added critical insight into what unfolded in those final moments. From his vantage point, the aircraft flew low overhead, engines audibly cutting out before falling silent. The witness described the aircraft's initial turn toward his position, then a pivot back southwest. Moments later, both engines appeared to fail entirely. With no more engine sound, only the eerie whistling through the air remained before the aircraft disappeared behind the trees and crashed. The impact site itself told a grim story. The aircraft came down nose first atop a steep hill at an elevation of about 880 feet, surrounded by trees and bordered by a narrow grassy path. The fuselage, driven into the terrain, rested at a magnetic heading of 300 degrees. Both wings bore signs of heavy impact trauma, particularly compression damage on the leading edges, indicating a steep descent. Evidence of fuel staining was present on the underside of the left wing, suggesting a possible leak or overflow from the fuel system, an ominous detail given what would later emerge in the investigation. The engines and propellers offered additional clues. The left engine was embedded into the hillside at a roughly 30-degree angle, its propeller still attached and buried 3 feet into the soil. The right engine, broken free from its wing mount, struck the ground almost vertically. Its propeller lodged 4 feet deep. Interestingly, the right propeller showed no S-bending or signs of rotation at the time of impact, typically indicative of an engine not producing power. The left propeller showed similar signs of low-power impact, with one blade bent back and the other blade tip missing. Debris scattered through the forested terrain, and the aircraft's empennage, the tail section, was wedged between trees, twisted to the left. The cockpit instruments were heavily damaged, offering little recoverable data at the scene. It was a catastrophic, unrecoverable descent, one that gave the pilot little, if any, opportunity for corrective action. While the NTSB has yet to release its final report, early indicators from the preliminary data already point towards several contributing factors that investigators are likely to examine in greater depth. What's emerging is not a singular failure, but a chain of technical issues, operational decisions, and potential oversights that, when combined, could have placed the aircraft in an unrecoverable situation. Although all conclusions remain tentative at this stage, the available evidence presents a compelling narrative of a ferry flight that began under constrained conditions and ended in tragedy due to a narrowing margin of safety. One of the first areas likely to draw scrutiny is the aircraft's airworthiness at the time of departure. The Cessna 310D was being ferried under a special flight permit, a temporary authorization that allows the relocation of an aircraft that may not meet standard airworthiness requirements. These permits are not uncommon, but they do assume that the aircraft is otherwise capable of safe flight for the specific purpose outlined, in this case, relocation for maintenance. However, the aircraft had not undergone a current annual inspection, and it appears that a preliminary check flight, which the owner had intended to be conducted prior to the ferry trip, was never performed. Without that functional check, there was no reliable way to assess whether the aircraft systems, especially those tied to fuel management, were performing within acceptable parameters. A second critical area under review involves the condition and configuration of the aircraft's fuel system. The fueling records and witness statements suggest that the Cessna had a history of fuel bladder leaks, particularly in the auxiliary tanks. On the day of the flight, only 3 tanks were topped off, the left main, left auxiliary, and right main, providing a total of approximately 57.5 gallons. The right auxiliary tank was intentionally left empty due to an active leak that would cause immediate fuel loss if used. While 57 gallons might appear sufficient for a flight of roughly 200 nautical miles, the reality becomes more complex when factoring in real-world performance and potential inefficiencies. Fuel consumption for a twin-engine aircraft like the Cessna 310D can vary significantly depending on load, configuration, and altitude. Under ideal conditions, a fully functional 310D might burn around 28 to 30 gallons per hour at cruise power settings. That would offer roughly 2 hours of endurance with a minimal reserve under the day's fueling conditions. But this assumes balanced fuel flow, accurate tank selection, and no external drag penalties. According to the report, the pilot elected to fly the entire route with the landing gear extended, possibly as a precaution due to the aircraft's lack of recent operation or concerns about gear retraction systems. However, this decision would have significantly increased drag and, by extension, fuel burn. Gear-down flight in similar aircraft has been shown to reduce range by 10 to 20% or more, depending on airspeed and altitude. If the pilot had not recalculated fuel endurance to account for that added drag, the flight could have unknowingly slipped into a high-risk fuel deficit. Also worth noting is the uncertainty surrounding fuel quantity measurements before takeoff. Neither the pilot nor the fueler could confidently estimate how much residual fuel was in the tanks before refueling. Compounding this, the asymmetric tank usage, filling some, avoiding others, may have introduced imbalances that weren't clearly monitored or corrected during the flight. Without accurate readings and active fuel management, it's plausible that one engine may have starved before the other, with the pilot potentially unaware of the situation until both power plants began to fail. The final moments of the flight seemed to support this scenario. A nearby witness reported hearing the engines sputter and eventually fall silent before the airplane descended steeply in impacted terrain. This auditory observation aligns with dual-engine power loss due to fuel starvation, although further forensic engine and fuel system examination will be necessary to confirm that hypothesis. The physical condition of the propellers reinforces this possibility. The damage pattern shows blades bent rearward without the typical signatures of powered rotation at impact, such as S-bending or scoring. These observations suggest that neither engine was producing meaningful thrust at the time of ground contact, which is consistent with an unpowered descent. Of course, the question remains, if the aircraft lost power, could anything have been done to improve the outcome? Unfortunately, the terrain appears to have offered few options. The aircraft crashed atop a steep, wooded hill, an area with limited visibility and virtually no suitable space for an emergency landing. Once both engines failed, the pilot would have had seconds to identify a viable forced landing site and likely found none. Even with textbook glide procedures, the geography of the area may have rendered a safe outcome unattainable once power was lost. It's important to stress that these observations are based solely on preliminary data. The investigation will continue to examine engine components, fuel lines, cockpit instruments, and maintenance history in search of more definitive causes. Toxicology results, maintenance logs, and further metallurgical testing may also provide new insight. But even now, the accident appears to underscore the fragility of aircraft performance when multiple safety margins are compromised. Degraded fuel system integrity, operational shortcuts, and environmental constraints each played a role that investigators will now seek to unravel in full. While the investigation is far from over, this case already offers a few timeless reminders for pilots everywhere. Lessons written not in textbooks, but in the realities of aviation when small oversights start to stack up. It's a story of how a few it-should-be-fine moments, skipping a test flight, assuming the fuel was enough, flying gear down just in case, can quietly add up until there's no runway left, literally or figuratively. So here's the friendly takeaway. Treat your pre-flight like your life depends on it, because, well, it does. Double-check the fuel, trust but verify that last maintenance detail, and when you hear yourself say, "Hey, we'll be all right," maybe pause and run the math again. Even the best pilots can get caught off guard when known risks get waved through in the name of convenience or routine. Flying is one of the greatest freedoms and responsibilities out there. And while there's a time for adventure, there's also a time for a full tank, a solid plan, and a landing gear that's up when it should be. Fly safe, fly smart. That's all for today's video. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe for more updates. On the morning of April 11th, 2025, a 1977 Cessna 310R, tail number November 8930 November, crashed in Boca Raton, Florida, claiming the lives of 3 members of the Stark family. What began as a routine flight from Boca Raton Airport ended in tragedy just 11 minutes after takeoff, leaving the aviation community grappling with questions about what went wrong. Early datas have been released, and they paint a picture of a desperate struggle to maintain control. Let's see what happened. The aircraft at the center of this incident was a Cessna 310R, a twin-engine workhorse from the late 1970s, known for its reliability and performance in general aviation. Operated by Robert Stark An 81-year-old aviator with decades of experience, this particular aircraft had been in his possession for many years, a testament to his deep connection with the plane. Robert was no ordinary pilot. Holding both instrument and multi-engine ratings, he was a former aerobatic competitor with the International Aerobatic Club, where he also served as a chief judge and local chapter president. His expertise in precision flying, particularly in high-stress aerobatic maneuvers, marked him as one of the most skilled stick-and-rudder pilots in the region. This background makes the nature of the accident all the more perplexing, as it suggests a pilot uniquely equipped to handle the Cessna 310R's complex dynamics. Joining Robert were his son, Stephen Stark, aged 54, and Stephen's daughter, Brooke Stark, aged 17. Stephen was himself a multi-engine and instrument-rated private pilot, bringing additional expertise to the cockpit. While Brooke was not a pilot, her presence underscored the Stark family's multi-generational passion for aviation, a legacy now marred by this devastating loss. The combination of two highly qualified pilots on board raises critical questions about the severity of the issue they faced, as their collective experience should have provided a strong foundation for managing in-flight challenges. The Cessna 310R itself is a sophisticated aircraft, designed with features that enhance its stability and control, particularly in adverse conditions. Its large, powerful rudder is a standout characteristic, engineered to counteract the adverse yaw that can occur during engine-out scenarios, a common risk in twin-engine operations. This design choice reflects the aircraft's role as a dependable platform for pilots navigating complex flight profiles. Yet, as preliminary reports suggest, it may have been this very rudder system, or a related control issue, that played a pivotal role in the events of April 11th. Understanding the interplay between the aircraft's engineering and the pilot's expertise sets the stage for unraveling the sequence of events that led to this heartbreaking outcome. The flight of November 8930 began unremarkably at 9:17 a.m. as the Cessna 310R lifted off from runway 05 at Boca Raton Airport. With Robert and Stephen Stark at the controls, the aircraft was expected to follow a routine departure, leveraging the pilot's extensive experience. Yet within 11 minutes, the flight would spiral into a chaotic sequence of events, culminating in a catastrophic impact near railroad tracks off North Military Trail. ADS-B data, video footage from bystanders, and preliminary observations provide a chilling window into the aircraft's erratic behavior, revealing a struggle against what appears to have been a severe control issue. Let's break down the flight's progression and the critical moments that defined its tragic end. Almost immediately after takeoff, the Cessna 310R exhibited unusual behavior. ADS-B data indicates the aircraft veered left during its initial climb, a deviation that quickly escalated into a sharp, uncommanded left turn. The aircraft never climbed above 500 feet above ground level, a strikingly low altitude for a twin-engine aircraft capable of rapid ascent. Ground speeds fluctuated between 99 and 148 knots, well below the Cessna 310R's typical cruise performance, suggesting the pilots were grappling with significant aerodynamic drag or control limitations. The flight path, as captured by ADS-B, shows a series of continuous left-hand turns, forming erratic loops that never stabilized. The first of these loops brought the aircraft back over the runway, but perpendicular to its alignment, rendering a landing attempt impossible. This early divergence from a normal departure profile points to a critical anomaly, likely centered on the aircraft's control surfaces. Multiple videos captured by onlookers, many of whom were drawn to the aircraft's low altitude and unusual maneuvers, offer critical visual evidence. These clips consistently show the Cessna 310R with both engines running, landing gear extended in some passes, and a rudder deflected hard to the left, a configuration that aligns with the suspected control issue. In one video, the right wing dips sharply, a telltale sign of an impending stall as the pilots fought to maintain lift at low airspeeds. Yet remarkably, the aircraft avoided stalling, a testament to the pilot's skill in managing extreme adverse yaw. The use of asymmetric thrust, likely reducing power on the right engine while increasing it on the left, and right aileron inputs is evident in the aircraft's sideslip posture, a high-drag state that made climbing or stabilizing the flight path extraordinarily difficult. The gear, observed retracted in some clips and extended in others, suggests the pilots were cycling it, possibly in an attempt to reduce drag or prepare for an emergency landing. As the flight progressed, the aircraft's path grew increasingly erratic, looping over residential areas and a nearby ball field. Videos from these later moments capture the Cessna at higher ground speeds, reaching up to 148 knots in the final loop, with the gear retracted. This increase in speed may reflect a desperate attempt to gain control or altitude, but it came too late. The final video shows the aircraft in a low pass, gear up, before it disappeared from view. Moments later, it impacted the ground near railroad tracks, leaving a concentrated wreckage field that indicates a high-energy descent. The absence of a stall, despite the severe control challenges, underscores the pilot's extraordinary efforts to keep the aircraft aloft. However, the relentless leftward pull, likely driven by a rudder locked in deflection, proved insurmountable, setting the stage for investigators to probe the mechanical and human factors behind this harrowing sequence. As investigators sift through the wreckage of November 8930, the focus is narrowing on a suspected rudder hard over to the left, a rare and catastrophic control issue that appears to have overwhelmed even the highly skilled pilots on board. With the NTSB still in the early stages of its investigation, no definitive cause has been identified, but a combination of ADS-B data, video evidence, and reported pilot communications offers tantalizing clues. This early analysis explores the primary hypotheses under consideration, from mechanical failures to procedural oversights, and underscores the critical safety practices that may come under scrutiny. While answers remain elusive, the questions raised here point to the complexity of unraveling such a tragedy and the lessons that may emerge for the aviation community. The leading theory at this stage centers on a rudder hard over, a condition where the rudder becomes locked in a fully deflected position, creating extreme adverse yaw and rendering the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. Video footage showing the rudder consistently deflected to the left, coupled with the aircraft's relentless left-hand turns, supports this hypothesis. One potential cause investigators are likely exploring is the presence of a rudder gust lock, a device used to secure the rudder against wind damage when parked. Unlike the standard control lock on Cessna aircraft, which secures ailerons and elevators via a pin through the yoke, rudder gust locks are often custom-made or model-specific. If such a lock was inadvertently left in place, it could have jammed the rudder during flight. Reports that the pilot mentioned a rudder gust lock to air traffic control, though unconfirmed without ATC audio, add weight to this scenario. Investigators will be keen to determine whether the aircraft, reportedly owned by Robert Stark for decades, was stored in a hangar, where gust locks are typically unnecessary, or on a ramp, and whether a stock or homemade lock was in use. Beyond gust locks, the Cessna 310R's rudder control system itself is under scrutiny. The aircraft employs a cable and pulley mechanism, with stainless steel cables running from the rudder pedals through a series of pulleys and springs to a bell crank at the rudder. This system, while reliable, is not immune to failure. A cable could have slipped off a pulley, become entangled or frayed, causing the rudder to seize. Alternatively, a foreign object, such as a tool or personal item, could have lodged in the rudder pedal assembly, a scenario not unlike a past helicopter crash where an iPad jammed the controls. The rudder's linkage to the nose wheel steering, which disengages when the gear retracts, adds another layer of complexity. Investigators will meticulously inspect the pulleys for wear, misalignment, or debris, and check the cables for proper tension and continuity. The absence of ATC audio, a critical piece of evidence, leaves open questions about whether the pilots reported a sudden onset of the issue or a progressive loss of control, which could point to different failure modes. Pilot procedures, particularly during pre-flight and takeoff checks, are also likely to draw attention. Aviation safety protocols emphasize a thorough pre-flight inspection, including a final walk-around, to verify that gust locks, tow bars, or other equipment are removed. The CIGAR's checklist, controls, instruments, gas, attitude, run-up, safety, includes a specific step to ensure free and correct movement of all control surfaces. Given the Stark pilot's extensive experience, it's reasonable to anticipate they followed these protocols, yet human factors, such as distractions or familiarity with a long-owned aircraft, could have played a role. The investigation will likely explore whether external pressures, like conversations or environmental factors at Boca Raton Airport, interfered with the pre-flight process. As the NTSB compiles maintenance records, witness statements, and wreckage analysis, the interplay of mechanical, procedural, and environmental factors will come into sharper focus, offering insights into how such a catastrophic failure could occur and how to prevent it in the future. That's our early look at the November 8930 November crash for now. As the investigation unfolds, we'll continue to track new findings and their implications for aviation safety. Thank you for joining, and stay tuned for more updates. On July 29, 2017, a simple flight meant to cap off a beautiful weekend ended in tragedy. A Cessna 172N, tail number November 5381 Juliet, crashed just moments after taking off from Big Bear City Airport in California, taking the lives of Brian and his fiancée, Rebecca, only a day after he'd proposed to her. It's a heartbreaking story, made even harder to grasp when you realize how quickly things went wrong. So what happened that day, and what can it teach us about flying, preparation, and the small details that can make all the difference? Let's find out in this episode. To understand this tragedy, we must first examine Brian's experience and preparation as a pilot, which played a critical role in the events that unfolded. At 30 years old, Brian held a commercial pilot certificate with ratings for single and multi-engine land airplanes, as well as instrument ratings for both airplanes and helicopters. His credentials were impressive, but a closer look reveals a career path that diverged significantly from the general aviation world of the Cessna 172 he was flying that day. Brian's most recent and substantial flight experience was not in fixed-wing aircraft, but in the cockpit of a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, where he served as a Chief Warrant Officer 2 in the U.S. Army. Military aviation, particularly in turbine-powered rotorcraft, demands precision and skill, but it operates under different principles than small piston-engine airplanes. The Black Hawk's turbine engines, for instance, don't require manual mixture adjustments, unlike the Cessna's Lycoming engine. According to the NTSB, Brian had accumulated approximately 750 hours of total flight time across all aircraft, yet only a fraction, about 225 hours, was logged in fixed-wing aircraft, primarily in a Diamond DA-40 years earlier. Notably, he hadn't flown a Cessna 172 in over a decade, a gap that introduced a significant challenge when he decided to rent one for this personal flight. Recognizing the need to refresh his skills, Brian took a proactive step by completing a checkout flight on May 1, 2017, with a certified flight instructor at a flight school in Apple Valley, California. This single session, conducted in a Cessna 172, covered essential maneuvers like slow flight and steep turns, and included instruction on leaning the fuel-air mixture, a critical procedure for operating piston engines at higher elevations. The instructor reported no concerns about Brian's performance, suggesting he demonstrated competence during the flight. However, this checkout was minimal, lasting just one session, which raises questions about whether it was sufficient to prepare him for the complexities of flying in a mountainous, high-altitude environment like Big Bear. In the 3 months leading up to the crash, Brian logged only 2 additional flights in the Cessna 172. One was a likely solo trip to Big Bear on May 10th, possibly to familiarize himself with the airport's unique challenges, such as its 6,752-foot elevation and surrounding terrain. The other was a longer cross-country flight to Palo Alto and back on July 10th, totaling about 8 hours. These flights indicate Brian was making an effort to regain confidence in the Cessna, but 3 flights over 3 months, after a 10-year hiatus from this aircraft type, offered limited opportunity to rebuild muscle memory or deepen his understanding of the airplane's performance under varying conditions. External sources, like FAA guidelines, emphasize that transitioning between aircraft types, especially after a long break, requires thorough retraining to account for differences in handling, systems, and operational environments. Brian's preparation, while well-intentioned, may have fallen short of what was needed for the demanding flight he undertook. As we shift from Brian's limited recent experience in the Cessna 172 to the circumstances surrounding the flight, it's critical to examine the aircraft itself and the environmental conditions at Big Bear City Airport on July 29, 2017. The airplane, a 1980 Cessna 172N, registered as November 5381 Juliet, was a reliable workhorse of general aviation, powered by a 160-horsepower Lycoming 0320 H2AD engine. Maintenance records confirmed its airworthiness, With only 54 hours accrued since its last 100-hour inspection on July 2, 2017, and 643 hours since the engine's overhaul in 2015. Post-accident examinations found no mechanical faults, ruling out engine failure or airframe issues as contributing factors. This reliability, however, did not shield the aircraft from the challenges posed by its operating environment. On the day of the flight, Brian added 5.14 gallons of 100 L aviation fuel, bringing the aircraft's weight to approximately 2,089 pounds, well below the maximum gross weight of 2,300 pounds as per NTSB calculations. This margin should have provided a buffer for performance, yet weight alone doesn't tell the full story. Big Bear City Airport, perched at 6,752 feet above sea level, is nestled in a mountainous region of Southern California, surrounded by peaks soaring between 8,000 and 10,000 feet. According to the FAA's Airport Facility Directory, the airport's high elevation and proximity to terrain demand careful planning, particularly for departures, which often require navigating rising terrain and adhering to noise abatement procedures to avoid nearby residential areas. The weather on that fateful afternoon appeared benign. Clear skies, 10 miles of visibility, and a temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. However, these conditions masked a significant hazard: density altitude. As outlined in FAA pamphlet FAAP 8742, density altitude reflects how temperature and elevation reduce air density, impacting engine power and aerodynamic lift. At Big Bear, the density altitude was calculated at 9,138 feet, nearly 2,400 feet higher than the field elevation. This high-density altitude diminished the Cessna's climb performance by reducing engine horsepower by approximately 25 to 30%, according to general aviation performance studies, and decreasing lift due to thinner air. The aircraft's pilot's operating handbook estimated a climb rate of 440 feet per minute under optimal conditions, but the high-density altitude likely eroded this capability significantly. In such an environment, proper fuel-air mixture management becomes paramount. The Cessna 172 normally aspirated engine requires pilots to lean the mixture at high elevations to optimize combustion, as a full rich setting delivers too much fuel for the thin air, choking the engine and further reducing power. Normally, failure to lean properly during takeoff at high-altitude airports can result in a loss of up to 10 to 15% of available power. Brian's checkout flight in May included instruction on mixture leaning, but whether he applied this knowledge effectively on the day of the crash remains a pivotal question. The interplay of the aircraft's configuration and the unforgiving environmental conditions at Big Bear set a challenging stage for the tragic flight that followed. The day prior, Brian had flown Rebecca to Big Bear, where he proposed to her on the airport ramp, a joyful moment captured in their storybook romance. On the accident day, they arrived at the airport under clear skies, unaware that their departure from runway 08 would end in catastrophe less than 2 minutes later. The sequence of events, coupled with critical misjudgments in a demanding environment, reveals how a cascade of factors led to the fatal crash. Surveillance footage from the airport captured the Cessna's takeoff at approximately 14:15, initially appearing normal as it lifted off runway 08. However, the aircraft struggled almost immediately, climbing at a sluggish 340 feet per minute, well below the expected 440 feet per minute outlined in the aircraft's performance charts. Witnesses near the runway's departure end described a troubling scene. The Cessna adopted a nose-high pitch attitude, appearing to hang on the prop as it barely cleared 100 feet above ground level. The engine sounded continuous, ruling out mechanical failure, but the aircraft's wings began to rock, signaling instability. Instead of continuing straight, or following the airport's recommended 10-degree left turn for departure, Brian initiated a premature 90-degree left turn onto the downwind leg of the traffic pattern. This maneuver, observed by a horrified couple on the ground shouting for the pilot to lower the nose, proved fatal. The aircraft sank rapidly, stalled, and crashed nose down into a wooded area 0.5 nautical miles south of the airport, killing both occupants instantly. The NTSB's investigation pinpointed the probable cause, an aerodynamic stall resulting from Brian's exceedance of the aircraft's critical angle of attack during takeoff in high-density altitude conditions. Several contributing factors amplified this outcome. The density altitude of 9,138 feet driven by the 25 degrees Celsius temperature and 6,752-foot elevation, severely degraded the Cessna's performance, reducing engine power and lift. Brian, whose primary experience was in turbine-powered helicopters, likely underestimated this impact. Unlike the UH-60 Blackhawk, the Cessna required precise mixture management to counteract the thin air. Post-accident examination found the mixture control in the full rich position, though its position during flight couldn't be confirmed. If Brian left it full rich or adjusted it richer to troubleshoot the sluggish climb, he inadvertently starved the engine of efficiency, potentially costing 10 to 15% of available power. Brian's limited recent experience in piston-engine aircraft and high-elevation environments further compounded the situation. With only 3 Cessna 172 flights in the prior 3 months, one being a trial run to Big Bear, he lacked the ingrained familiarity needed to instinctively manage the aircraft's performance under such conditions. The added weight of a passenger, approximately 177 pounds, reduced climb performance compared to his likely solo flight to Big Bear in May, a difference he may not have fully anticipated. When the aircraft failed to climb as expected, Brian likely pulled back on the controls to gain altitude, a reflex possibly rooted in his helicopter experience where pitch adjustments directly influence lift. In a fixed-wing aircraft, this increased the angle of attack, slowing the airspeed to a critical 49 knots, as estimated from surveillance video, and triggering the stall. External insights from aviation safety studies, such as those by the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee, highlight that pilots transitioning from military to general aviation often face challenges adapting to environmental factors like density altitude. Brian's single checkout flight, while covering mixture leaning and basic maneuvers, didn't simulate the specific challenges of a high-density altitude departure with a passenger. The NTSB noted that the aircraft's airspeed and climb rate were insufficient to sustain flight, particularly after the premature turn, which increased drag and destabilized the aircraft. This tragic sequence underscores how environmental constraints, coupled with human factors like incomplete preparation and instinctive but incorrect responses, converge to produce a devastating outcome. After all, this heartbreaking story reminds us that even seasoned pilots, like our friend with his military wings, need a bit of extra TLC when hopping back into a new cockpit. One quick refresher flight? Not quite enough for tricky mountain airports. Think of it like riding a bike after years. You'd wobble a bit, right? So, take your time, grab a few more lessons, and chat with a CFI who knows the ropes. Mountain flying's no joke. Those high altitudes and pesky terrain need respect. Check your aircraft's limits, study the weather, and always have a plan B. The FAA's got great tips in their flying handbook, nudging us to double-check everything before we go wheels up. Let's keep the skies friendly by learning from this. Every flight's a chance to grow, so embrace the prep, lean into the training, and never let confidence outfly caution. Here's to safe adventures and happy landings. That's all for today's video. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe